Toward a History of the Critique of Value by Anselm Jappe. This is from 2014 and was originally published in Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism. Or Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, excuse me. Okay. Towards a History of the Critique of Value by Anselm Jappe. Translated by Salvatore, Engel-Di, Mauro, and Alastair Hemmens. In 1991, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was about to breathe its last. The euphoria of victory was spreading among those who had always, or for some time at least, been convinced that free markets and Western democracy were the last word in history. For the radical left, including those who never had any illusions about, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, there was much consternation. Was capitalism really impossible to overcome? Was it necessary to limit themselves from now on to making the occasional modest reform? In this context, the appearance of a German-language book entitled The Collapse of Modernization, From the Fall of Barrack Socialism to World Economic Crisis by Robert Kurz could not but seem bizarre. Nonetheless, this book, published by a major publishing house, made a substantial impact in a then recently, quote, reunited, end quote, Germany. Up to this point, the book's author, Robert Kurz, who lived from 1943 to 2012, was only known in restricted Marxist circles for running a rather obscure journal that had recently changed its name from Marxist Critique, Marxist Critique, to Crisis. Kurz claimed in his book that, far from signaling the final triumph of Western capitalism, the fall of Eastern European countries was only a stage in the gradual collapse of a world economy based on the commodity value, abstract labor, and money. After 2 centuries, the capitalist mode of production had reached its historical limits. The rationalization of production, which involves the replacement of human labor by technology, undermines the basis of the production of value, and therefore of surplus value, which is the sole objective of producing commodities. However, nothing but living labor, the labor required in the act of its execution, creates value and surplus value. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, had been nothing but a variation of world market society. It was a form of, quote, catch-up modernization, end quote. That is to say, the violent introduction of the basic mechanisms of value production in a backward country that would not otherwise have been able to become an autonomous part of the world market. If the USSR was not, quote, socialist, end quote, this was not only due to the dictatorship of a bureaucratic class, as the anti-Stalinist left claimed. The real reason was that the central categories of capitalism, the commodity, value, labor, money, had never been abolished. All that had ever been claimed was that these were, quote, better managed, end quote, for the, quote, benefit of the workers, end quote. What had collapsed was not a, quote, alternative, end quote, to the capitalist system, but rather the, quote, weakest link, end quote, in this system. However, the mechanism of which the, quote, socialist, end quote, countries had been victims was also about to bring the, quote, winners, end quote, into crisis. Western capitalism was destined very soon to enter into a stage of great turmoil that would lead to the final collapse of society based on commodity fetishism. What mechanism was it? It was the impossibility of containing the growth of productive forces, notably the enormous productivity gains derived from microelectronics since the 1970s, in the straitjacket of commodity value production. Value, as a social form, does not recognize the actual usefulness of commodities. Value only considers the quantity of, quote, abstract labor, end quote, that they contain. That is, the quantity of pure expenditure of human energy measured in time. The first book by Kurz, which, in the next 2 years, would be followed by 3 more and eventually a dozen in total, already contained a great deal of what would typify the critique of value and Kurz's expression of it in particular. First, a ruthless critique of all variations of capitalism often expressed with genuine indignation. And, second, an accompanying and equally ruthless critique of conventional approaches to anti-capitalist theory, the class struggle in the proletariat as the revolutionary subject, the defense of work and workers, and the conceptualization of capitalism as essentially consisting of a domination by the, quote, capitalist class, end quote, who owns the means of production. Kurz harshly reassessed all of these concepts, not of course in order to conclude that it was impossible to escape capitalism, but rather in order to show that they were still insufficient, quote, imminent critiques, end quote, that merely aimed to better distribute and manage the basic categories of capitalism, not to abolish the basic categories of capitalism. His Collapse of Modernization already contains this mix of rigorous, quote, categorical critique, end quote, with detailed analyses of contemporary economic and social processes. One can equally see the author's disdain for nearly all forms of traditional Marxism and other radical left approaches, for all bourgeois thought, and even for part of Marx's own work. Nothing but the critique of political economy, as developed by Marx, would suffice as the theoretical foundation for the demolition of left-wing certitudes. Aside from this, Kurz's work attracted much interest as a result of his brilliant, vigorous, and often polemical style, and his penchant for drastic descriptions of looming catastrophes that were just around the corner. And while this, quote, apocalyptical, end quote, side often played a great role in drawing wider public and media attention to the critique of value, it also caused some equivocation. There's a footnote here, and it just says the author of this article, Anselm Jappe, joined Crisis in 1994. If, when it first came to public attention, the critique of value could not be, quote, pigeonholed, end quote, into the usual forms of critical thought, it was neither Marxist, nor anarchist, nor councilist, nor situationist, nor ecologist, nor radical democratic, nor the Frankfurt School, etc. It was due to the fact that it emerged at the margins of the usual spaces of public debate. The first issue of Marxische Kritik was self-published in 1987 in Nuremberg. It was not until 1990, with issue number 8/9, that the journal was to call itself Crisis and be published by an actual publisher. In the midst of such infighting, a core group emerged that consisted of Kurz, Peter Klein, Roswitha Schultz, Ernst Lohoff, are H is silent. Ernst Lohoff, might be how you pronounce that actually. Norbert Trankler. None of them are academics, journalists, or intellectuals by profession. Kurz himself continued to make a living by working night shifts for a paper delivery service. Independence has its price. The crisis group had almost no formal structure and instead functioned through concentric social circles. Beyond the editorial board, long concentrated in Nuremberg, there was a primary circle of collaborators who met several times a year. There were also thematic conferences open to the public twice a year. The non-institutional and informal character of the group allowed different levels of participation that still characterizes German-language journals aligned with the critique of value. The split schisms and departure that marked crisis from its inception were the result of the rapid radicalization of such an iconoclastic approach. Every issue of the journal, particularly in the beginning, slew a, quote, sacred cow, end quote, of the left, the centrality of the proletariat, the very notion of a, quote, revolutionary subject, end quote, class struggle, and eventually labor itself. At the same time, a crisis theory was emerging which held that capitalism would not be undermined by opposition from the exploited, but by its own need for value creation, which the microelectronics revolution had surpassed. Although Marx's critique of political economy remained central, at a time even the left was, quote, burying, end quote, Marx every day by proclaiming that history had proved him wrong, there was a definitive rupture with those Marxists who remained. While for the latter, capitalism still had a long life ahead of it, at least as long as some revolutionary subject does not put an end to it. If not the classical proletariat, then one of its successors, contingent laborers, the populations of the global South, women. Kurz and his comrades claim that capitalism will collapse because capitalism can no longer produce enough value. However, there is no guarantee that this collapse will lead to some sort of emancipation. No social group defined according to its role in the production of value can be considered, quote, in itself, end quote, beyond capitalist logic and therefore is necessarily fated to overcome it. The starting point for the critique of value therefore entails a rereading of Marx's work. It does not claim to restore the, quote, true, end quote, Marx, but places a lot of emphasis on distinguishing between an, quote, exoteric, end quote, and an, quote, esoteric, end quote, Marx. Footnote. For a Kurtzian interpretation of Marx, see his annotated anthology from 2000, aside from Kurtz's many great articles published in Crisis and Exit. End of footnote. The latter, the esoteric Marx, can be found in a rather finite portion of his mature work, in its most concentrated form in the first chapter of the first volume of Capital. Here he examines the basic forms of the capitalist mode of production, namely the commodity, value, money, and abstract labor. In contrast to bourgeois economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and, implicitly at least, almost all later Marxists, Marx does not treat these categories as neutral, natural, and trans-historical presuppositions of all social life, only the management of which can be discussed, but not their actual existence. On the contrary, Marx analyzed them, not without hesitations and contradictions, however, as elements unique to capitalist society and at the same time as negative and destructive categories. At a deep level, capitalism is distinguished by the fact that society in its entirety is dominated by such anonymous and impersonal factors. It is this that Marx calls, quote, commodity fetishism, end quote, which is by no means reducible to a simple, quote, mystification, end quote, of capitalist reality. In this most innovative part of his work, Marx had determined the fundamental mechanisms of capitalism in an age where it was still mixed with pre-modern elements. In most of Marx's work, however, it is the, quote, exoteric, end quote, aspect that predominates. There he described, in a manner still unsurpassed, the historical forms that the basic logic of capitalism was taking in his own time. Thus, for a long historical period, the structural necessity for value to accumulate through the, quote, absorption, end quote, of living labor took the form of an industrial proletariat that was extremely exploited and not given full rights, such as the right to strike or to vote, in a manner that remained almost feudal. Right to stroke is funny. Nonetheless, the substance of the basic social categories of capitalism has changed considerably over the span of 2 centuries. It is obvious that Marx, who, despite everything, remained within the parameters of his time, could not always distinguish between the core of capitalism and its historical and empirical forms, such as the, quote, class struggle, end quote, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Later, Marxism, in nearly all its variations, including the most, quote, heterodox, end quote, almost immediately sidelined the Marxian critique. It is always important to make the distinction between, quote, Marxist and, quote, Marxian. Of value, money, the commodity, and labor, tacitly or explicitly accepting their permanent existence. Footnote. Kurz terms it the, quote, Marxism of the workers' movement, end quote, and Postone, quote, traditional Marxism, end quote, end footnote. It was now only a question of how these categories were distributed. Rather than questioning commodity value as the regulating principle of production in social life, the labor movement and its theoreticians struggled simply for a more, quote, just, end quote, distribution of it. In accepting the framework of capitalist production, they concerned themselves essentially with gaining better living conditions for the laboring classes. Beginning in the last decades of the 19th century, Marxism therefore became, apart from a bit of rhetoric, a theory of the effective integration of the proletariat into value society. The labor movement itself often pushed the pure logic of value against the narrow viewpoints of capitalist bosses, who were still imbued with attitudes inherited from prior epochs, but ultimately realized that higher wages and union rights were not at all incompatible with capitalist profits. Quite the opposite, in fact. The, quote, gains, end quote, of the labor movement were not, quote, won, end quote, from a reluctant capital, but rather constituted its most efficacious form of development. This is especially true of Western social democratic branches of the labor movement. Wherever a variation of Leninist took power, as in Russia and later in other countries on the periphery of the world market, there was, if anything, quote, catch-up modernization, end quote. Far from abolishing the commodity, abstract labor, value, and money, they ended up introducing them to agrarian countries. The totalitarian violence employed in doing so, which shocked Western democracies, that would then use opposition to this violence in order to legitimize themselves, was, however, nothing but an accelerated form of primitive accumulation, carried out within a framework of state violence that had also laid the groundwork for the takeoff of Western capitalism, most notably between the 16th and 18th centuries. The difference was that countries arriving late to the world market needed to repeat this process much more rapidly and to do so by maintaining an isolationist regime. Otherwise, the more, quote, advanced, end quote, countries would have quickly wiped out their nascent industries with cheaper goods. Other, quote, latecomers, end quote, like Germany, Italy, and Japan also resorted to authoritarian and statist means to build infrastructure and create industries that private initiative could not have produced in a system of world market competition. The state and private capital, far from being antagonistic, have always been two complementary poles of capitalist development, even if the state and private capital's respective influences have changed according to the historical period. Private capital does not in any way struggle against the state, nor does it systematically seek to limit the state. The cult of labor reached its apogee in these, quote, catch-up modernization, end quote, societies, such as with the famed Stakhanov. The theoretical status of labor is not always very clear in the work of Marx. However, it is undeniable that he thought labor in the form of, quote, abstract labor, end quote, the pure expenditure of energy, is a negative and, quote, fetishistic, end quote, category. It is abstract labor, or, to be more precise, the abstract side of specific forms of labor, and it alone that gives commodities value, and which therefore also forms the, quote, substance, end quote, of capital. Capital is not the opposite of labor, but its accumulated form. Living labor and dead labor are not two antagonistic entities, but rather different, quote, stages of aggregation, end quote, of the same substance of labor. The laborer, as such, is not at all outside of capitalist society, but embodies one of its two poles. It is therefore possible to conclude from Marx's analysis that a, quote, workers' revolution against capitalism, end quote, is a logical impossibility. There can only be a revolution against the subjection of society and individuals to the logic of valorization and abstract labor. A critique of labor such as this is the necessary outcome of the Marxian critique of abstract labor, which Marx considered his most important discovery, even if he did not fully appreciate all its implications. Nothing of this discovery remains in the labor movement. On the contrary, labor is exalted, and the main critique of the bourgeoisie is that it does not labor. The revolution will then be limited to handing over legal ownership of the means of production to laborers in order to continue with labor that produces value, along with money, etc., although under, quote, workers' control, end quote. Footnote. Almost all anti-Stalinist critiques have focused on the domination of a bureaucratic caste over the apparatus of production. This is certainly true, but it was nothing but the inevitable consequence of continuing with producing commodities, something that has hardly ever been confronted. An objection can very much be made to this by the groups represented in Non-Market Socialism, edited by John Crump and Maximilien Rubel, which features several anti-Stalinist critiques of value and commodity production. Not obviously, this can't be said of all anti-Stalinist leftists, of course, but it can certainly be said of a few. Anyway, end footnote. In some, quote, backward, end quote, countries where there was only a rudimentary work mentality, the, quote, labor movement, end quote, then arrived as a force that imposed a, quote, love of work, end quote. Quote, really existing socialism, end quote, was a variation of world market society with very specific characteristics derived from the absence of a market. How can you have commodity production, value production, money, capital, etc., and all these things that are essentially market categories and not have a market? That seems extremely incoherent to me. This is just a side comment, but yeah. At first, it was able to catch up in ways that would have probably been impossible through private capitalism. However, as an autarky, it could not keep up with the later development of the forces of production, especially the microelectronics revolution of the 1970s. It finally fell apart because it could no longer compete with Western productivity, thereby revealing that it had never been a, quote, alternative, end quote, even an abortive one, but rather a, quote, dead branch, end quote, of world capitalism. No project of emancipation can therefore be based on labor, primarily because labor has never corresponded to productive human activity or to Marx's, quote, metabolism with nature, end quote. Labor as a social form is a, quote, real abstraction, end quote, that reduces all social actors to quantitative expressions of the same social substance devoid of content that aims at nothing but its own accumulation. Wherever production does not serve to satisfy needs, but only the goal of transforming 100 euros into 110, and then 120, etc., the process can be termed, quote, tautological, end quote. It does nothing but repeat itself, but on an ever larger scale, following a blind dynamism that consumes human energy and natural resources. The valorization of value is imposed on social actors, including capitalists. To believe in the existence of a grand capitalist conspiracy is just a way of reassuring oneself. The truth is much more tragic. Nobody is in control of this self-referential mechanism that sacrifices the concrete world to a fetishized abstraction that must ceaselessly grow. For the same reason, all moralizing critiques of capitalism are useless, even if no one is obliged to like the great and small, quote, officers and sub-officers of capital, end quote. The conflicts between social classes, and above all the conflict between the owners of the means of production and the sellers of labor power, between the holders of constant capital and the holders of variable capital, between living labor and dead labor, obviously play an important part. However, they are not the essence of capitalism. All these phenomena are nothing but the concrete, visible, and variable historical forms in which the endless accumulation of value takes place. Classic social struggles Classic social struggles revolve around the distribution of surplus value. The existence of value is already presupposed as a neutral, quote, good, end quote, that is simply to be seized. The capital difference between concrete wealth, which can effectively be seized, and abstract value is not taken into consideration. It is not possible to abolish value without abolishing the labor that created value. This is why contesting capitalism in the name of labor makes no sense. It would make just as little sense to set good concrete labor against bad abstract labor. When all forms of labor cease to be reduced to what they have in common, the expenditure of energy, there will no longer be, quote, concrete, end quote, labor. Such a category is itself an abstraction. There will instead be a multiplicity of activities with specific goals in mind, as indeed used to be the case in pre-capitalist societies, where the term, quote, labor, end quote, in the modern sense was unknown. This is even truer today. Historically, the labor movement found some justification in the fact that capitalism, in its long expansionary phase, effectively enabled some redistribution, with at times notable results for the laboring classes. Even if overcoming capitalism was never really within their horizon, quote, imminent, end quote, critiques could boast of having obtained some important successes that could lead to the belief that capitalism could be, quote, domesticated, end quote, in a, quote, market democracy, end quote. However, technological progress, especially the application of microelectronics to production, has continuously reduced the role of living labor. Certain businesses can still make large profits, but the system in its entirety is beginning to lose its, quote, substance, end quote. Capitalism is sawing off the branches on which it sits. The realization of value through the use of living labor, It has run this risk since the Industrial Revolution and the introduction of machinery into production. For a long time, the decline in the value, and therefore of the portion of surplus value contained in each commodity, was compensated and overcompensated for by the absolute expansion of production, by filling the world with commodities with all the repercussions that entailed. Footnote: Kurz, in a major work, retraces the history of market society over nearly 1,000 pages, from its origins at the end of the Middle Ages and the revolution brought by the introduction of firearms. End footnote. With the end of the Fordist era, the last model of accumulation predicated on the massive employment of living labor was exhausted. Since then, technology, which does not create value, performs the essence of production in almost all domains. The absolute amount of value, and therefore of surplus value, is declining precipitously. This puts the whole of value-based society into crisis, including the laborers themselves. It is no longer exploitation that is the main problem created by capitalism. Rather, it is the rising masses of, quote, superfluous, end quote, human beings, people who are unnecessary for production and are therefore unable to consume. After its long period of expansion for the past several decades, capitalism, despite, quote, globalization, end quote, has actually been shrinking. People, regions, and communities that are able to take part in, quote, normal, end quote, production and consumption cycles are becoming more and more like, quote, islands, end quote, in a rising sea of outcasts who are no longer even worth exploiting. Further, it is pointless to demand, quote, jobs, end quote, for them, because they are not needed for production, and it would be absurd to force people to do meaningless jobs as the preliminary condition for their own survival. It would be better to demand that everyone have the right to live well, regardless of whether he has or has not succeeded in selling a labor power that no one wants anymore. Why has the capitalist system not yet completely collapsed? It is mainly because of, quote, financialization, end quote. That is to say, the flight into, quote, fictitious capital, end quote. After real accumulation came to a near standstill, the decision of the USA to abandon the dollar's gold standard in 1971 being a kind of symbolic date for this, the ever greater recourse to credit has allowed the perpetuation of accumulation to be simulated. This atmosphere of simulation, one could say virtualization, then spread to the rest of society, and it explains the great diffusion of so-called, quote, postmodern, end quote, approaches in all areas during the 1980s and 1990s. In the credit system, expected future profits that will never be realized have already been consumed and keep the economy afloat. As is well known, credit and other forms of fictitious money, such as stock values and real estate prices, have reached astronomical proportions and feed gigantic speculation that can, as in 2008, have terrible repercussions on the, quote, real, end quote, economy. However, far from being the cause of capitalist crises and growing poverty, speculation has for decades actually helped to defer the greatest crisis. It is caused by the fact that, even though they proliferate in greater quantities, all commodities and additional services represent an ever lower quantity of value. This also implies that a large part of money in global circulation is, quote, fictitious, end quote, because that money no longer represents labor that is actually spent, quote, productively, end quote. All, quote, kickstart measures, end quote, taken by governments after the 2008 crisis are therefore nothing but accountancy acrobatics, where one adds another zero to numbers that are already complete fantasies. There can never be any new capitalist prosperity because labor-replacing technologies cannot be eliminated from capitalist production. It would be equally pointless to expect China or other, quote, emerging countries, end quote, to save capitalism. Their supposed economic successes are based in part on a rise in the cost of raw material and in part on unilateral exports to wealthy countries that will only last as long as these countries themselves manage to defer the real eruption of the crisis at home. It is therefore not a matter of predicting some future collapse of capitalism, but to recognize that the crisis is already taking place and getting worse despite brief short-term recoveries. It is a crisis that is far from just economic. It entails all sorts of upheavals, from new forms of war to devastating effects on individual psyches. Kurz describes school shootings as particularly vivid manifestations of the, quote, death drive, end quote, at the heart of capitalism. Footnote. Unlike in classical imperialism, which would not make sense anymore, given the many regions of the world that have become of low economic interest, it is a way for powerful countries to avoid being caught up in the consequences of the world crisis, such as uncontrollable migration. End footnote. The critique of value is therefore a radical critique of the whole of capitalism and not just its neoliberal phase. Even if critique of value authors were among its most virulent critics in the 1990s, well, the left seemed either paralyzed or fascinated. It is impossible to return to full employment in Keynesian policies, to greater state intervention in the welfare system of yesteryear. They were abandoned because the entire capitalist dynamic was running out of steam, not because of a conspiracy led by neoliberal economists and greedy capitalists. Moreover, a return to such policies would not in any way be desirable. Capitalism must be overcome by abolishing its foundations, not by returning to seemingly more tolerable forms of slavery and alienation. The question of social emancipation therefore rests upon new foundations. Looking back, practically the entire labor movement of the past, revolutionary or reformist, with its more or less Marxist theorists, is shown to have been an imminent part of the very capitalism it claimed to be against. This does not take anything away from what its members were able to achieve that was just and necessary. Labor was the common ground of both capital and the wage system. Now, old understandings of emancipation have entered into crisis alongside capital. Now, old understandings of emancipation have entered into crisis alongside capital, thereby demonstrating that theirs was always a case of, quote, sibling rivalry, end quote. Indeed, the critique of value is itself part of the historical process. Its emergence at the end of the 1980s was not due to the arrival of theorists who had finally, quote, understood, end quote, all that traditional Marxists until then had not. It instead reflects the end of capitalist expansion and therefore the end of the possibility of redistributing its wealth, which is, moreover, often toxic, without questioning the nature of the system itself. The radical Marxian critique of value and abstract labor, which, like Sleeping Beauty, has remained dormant for more than a century, apparently of little, quote, use, end quote, in the face of actual struggles, now reveals itself to be the best explanation of the decline of commodity society. The critique of value was not therefore a simple case of, quote, theoretical progress, end quote, which could have taken place in another historical context. It represents instead the first recognition of a profound historical rupture. Its first formulations were equally marked by the act of rupture. Hostile towards eclecticism and the typically stifling intellectual exchanges of academia, refusing, in contrast to nearly all variations of Marxism, to sign up to an already existing tradition and define itself in relation to other Marxist thinkers. The critique of value had the firm intention of starting almost from scratch, using Marx's critique of political economy as its only weapons. Its relationship with other forms of social critique has generally been marked, therefore, by reciprocal polemics, and it has often been met with both hostility and attempts to ignore it. Although the critique of value does not consist itself does not consider itself to be the simple continuation of an already existing theoretical tradition, even the most heretical, some historical roots are nevertheless detectable. The main influences are Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness and the Frankfurt School, notably Theodor Adorno and equally Alfred Sohn-Rethel, from whom they take concepts like, quote, real abstraction, end quote, and value as a, quote, social synthesis, end quote. As for crisis theory, Kurz acknowledges Rosa Luxemburg and Henrik Grossman for having at least posed the problem, albeit insufficiently. Isaac Rubin's Essays on Marx's Theory of Value from 1924/1928, rediscovered in the 1970s, provided a number of important ideas for understanding value. Notwithstanding, these same authors have never been fetishized by the critique of value and have been, at one time or another, subject to severe criticism. In general, the critique of value does not purport to be a discussion of other people's theories, but rather an analysis of capitalism's past and present, which can sometimes be analyzed by examining other theories on the same subject. Although it lays no claim to such a title, there is an approach that could be termed the, quote, other branch, end quote, of the critique of value, namely that of Moishe Postone, professor of history at the University of Chicago. Postone studied in Frankfurt in the early 1970s in a milieu that was still heavily marked by the influence of Adorno. His major work was published in the early 1990s at about the same time as the theory developed by the authors of Crisis was reaching its early maturity and making inroads. Albeit outside the remit of this article, Postone's theory deserves just as detailed an introduction as that of Robert Kurz and other German-speaking critique of value authors. One second. Essentially proposing a rereading of Marx's work, a reading that constantly flies in the face of, quote, traditional Marxism, end quote. Postone focuses on the concept of, quote, abstract labor, end quote, in addition to examining its historical foundations such as, quote, abstract time, end quote. Without any knowledge of one another, Postone and the authors of Crisis developed their ideas at the same time and started on the basis of the same assumptions. There are striking similarities between them on a number of points. However, the main difference is that Postone does not have an explicit theory of crisis. He does not see a historical limit to accumulation that results from, quote, the desubstantialization, end quote, of value. Unfortunately, there was never really any dialogue between Postone and Kurz, which can perhaps be explained by the very different scope and style of their respective approaches. There are currently no other critical approaches close to the critique of value. In French-speaking circles, there is some convergence with Guy Debord and Bourdigists such as Jacques Camat and authors inspired by them. The differences prevail, however, and it has had no real influence. Jean-Marie Vincent, one of the first French academics to be interested in the Frankfurt School, developed some ideas that occasionally paralleled the critique of value. He, however, like a number of others that have emerged in recent years who sometimes claim to adhere to the critique of value, is not interested in renouncing, quote, class struggle, end quote, and the search for a subject that will finally defeat capitalism. The possibility of an objective crisis, moreover, is only vaguely alluded to. From another direction, André Gortz made an explicit move towards the critique of value in his later writings, after having already formulated in around 1980 a critique of labor and value. He himself later admitted, having read critique of value material, that his thinking on the matter was not up to scratch. For 25 years, the critique of value has been, at least in its German form, and ever-evolving theory. While a good part of its theoretical breakthroughs were made before 1993, there have been some important developments since. Indeed, the theorists associated with the journal Exit nowadays prefer to speak of the, quote, critique of value disassociation, end quote. Disassociation theory was introduced in 1992 by Roswitha Schulz. It concerns the, quote, dissociation, end quote, or, quote, divide, end quote, that is found at the foundations of the very existence of value as a fetishistic social form. Abstract labor. Footnote. In 2004, after much internal conflict, Kurz and Schulz were expelled from Crisis and founded Exit soon after. The reasons for the split were less over the theoretical terrain than the question of the status of theory, as further evolution was to demonstrate. While Exit radicalized the critique of the Enlightenment, in a broad sense including all thought that associates itself with it, and of, quote, value dissociation, end quote, refusing any hasty attempt at drawing immediately practical conclusions. Crisis, which continued to be published under the same title and retained founding members like Lohoff, Trenkler, Schandl, and Klein, became more involved in linking the critique of value with some social movements, like, quote, freeware, end quote, free computer software or alternative economies. The relationship between the two journals remains tense and marked by diatribe. End footnote. Abstract labor, the creator of value, can only exist when another part of social reproduction is done in a non-commodity form that is not, quote, labor, end quote. It particularly concerns those domestic activities normally carried out by women. Both the public and private spheres are equally necessary to capitalist society, but the domestic private sphere appears as inferior and outside society. The fact that these activities do not produce value directly does not mean that this sphere is, quote, free or, quote, non-reified. These activities play an auxiliary role for abstract labor and carry abstract labor's mark. Concretely, the male, quote, laborer, end quote, could not create value without a woman to look after him, to raise his children, etc. Value is therefore structurally, quote, masculine, end quote, even if some women do produce value and may even manage its production. According to the critique of value dissociation, the society of value and labor is based, historically and logically, on an exclusionary logic. A person is only considered a full, quote, subject, end quote, once they have completely interiorized the work mentality and its corollaries. Self-discipline, rationality, hard-heartedness towards oneself and others, competitiveness, etc., and rid themselves of everything else. This is what is meant by, quote, dissociation, end quote. The exclusion of women, of non-whites, and of other, quote, minority, end quote, subjects was not therefore truly antithetical to the principle of value, which gives a false sense of universality and the promise of eventually giving everyone the status of capitalist, quote, subject, end quote. Such social exclusions were constitutive from the beginning, even if their empirical forms have changed a lot since the Age of Enlightenment. Indeed, the critique of value radicalizes the, quote, dialectic of enlightenment, end quote, seeing it as nothing more than the historical epoch when capitalist categories were definitively implanted into people's minds. While the entire left, and often Marx himself, wanted to realize or to, quote, complete, end quote, the substance of the Enlightenment that the bourgeoisie had, quote, betrayed, end quote, The critique of value association sees in this very substance the birth of the modern subject that exists only for and through capitalist competition. Enlightenment philosophers, Immanuel Kant above all, formulated the premises of sexism, racism, and anti-Semitism that typify modernity while presenting them as the conditions of freedom. Quote, reason, end quote, which the Enlightenment wished would triumph, and which the left had always laid claim, is nothing but, quote, bloody reason, end quote, for Kurz, an ideology of the submission of life in its entirety to the imperatives of valorization that had led to the world's destruction. It's a very one-sided understanding of what reason entails. There's a difference between, in Kant, say for example, between prudential reason and categorical reason. And the kind of critique of reason that just reduces reason to what is like prudentially necessary to achieve an instrumental end does not fully encapsulate what reason entails. There's a certain reason that could lead one to create without what I believe Horkheimer calls subjective reason, that is entirely instrumental and self-serving, viewing things external to oneself as objects to be manipulated for one's own ends, which is in terms of like the normative terrain, is entirely ununiversalizable. Never mind, forget what I'm saying here. Just saying there's more to... Basically, I was going too deep into it. Basically, is that reason is, not strictly speaking, an ideology of the submission of life in its entirety to the imperatives of valorization. That is a bold statement that I don't think can hold up to scrutiny. Irrationalism, e.g. romanticism, vitalism, existentialism, only represents the other face of capitalist reason and is not an alternative. It has equally contributed to the catastrophes that have marked the entire history of capitalism. With these kinds of analyses, the critique of value dissociation claims to have overcome its initially, quote, objectivist, end quote, approach. Ideologies are not a simple, quote, reflection, end quote, of, quote, economic reality, end quote. Value constitutes a fetishistic structure that has a, quote, objective and a, quote, subjective side. The difficulty of living in a society dominated by value necessarily leads to the creation of all sorts of ideologies to explain the suffering caused by such a society, and that enable the subjects of labor to project onto others the qualities that they are forced to expel from themselves, e.g., quote, laziness, end quote, emotions, end quote. The critique of value in its German as well as Postonian version has devoted much attention to anti-Semitism. Rather than the reemergence of something pre-modern, it is seen as an attempt to give a pseudo, quote, concrete, end quote, face to the terrible untouchable abstraction that is value. It is clear, moreover, that this conception of capitalist society as being essentially fetishistic is miles away from, quote, historical materialism, end quote, with its distinction between, quote, base and, quote, superstructure. Fetishistic and unconscious social practices create both the subjective and the objective. Accusations of, quote, economism, end quote, even if they are often correct in relation to traditional Marxism, cannot be applied to the critique of value. Further, even value itself is not a, quote, total, end quote, structure. It is, quote, totalitarian, end quote, in the sense that it aspires to turn everything into a commodity, but it will never be able to because such a society would be completely unlivable. There would no longer, for example, be friendship, love, the bringing up of children, etc. The necessity for value to expand pushes value towards destroying the entire concrete world and at every level, economic, environmental, social, and cultural. The critique of value does not only foresee an economic crisis of unprecedented dimensions, but also the end of an entire, quote, civilization, end quote, if one can call it that. Even so, human life has not always been based on value, money, and labor, even if it seems that some kind of fetishism has existed everywhere. It must be underlined that these categories are not, quote, ontological, end quote, or transhistorical. In contrast to most forms of Marxism, the critique of value is not a theory of all history, only of capitalism. Kurz affirms in his last book that it is not possible to speak of commerce, money, or commodities in pre-capitalist societies. What may seem similar in them actually had profoundly different functions. There obviously remains the question of how to exit from capitalism. The critique of value has often been reproached for its refusal to cede to pressures to come up with practical actions. Indeed, from the beginning, it has defended the position that autonomy is necessary in order to think about what is perhaps not immediately realizable. The impoverishment of social reflection throughout the 20th century was also the result of its subordination to the pressures of such practical immediacy, parties, unions, social movements. The critique of value has always held this, quote, false immediacy, end quote, pseudo-activism, end quote, along with immediately opposing one's own subjectivity against an objectivity that is thought of as the eternal repetition of the same, to be purely, quote, immanent, end quote, forms of critique. At the same time, the critique of value has always rejected the, quote, ivory tower, end quote, label. It is a long way from impartial academic contemplation. From the start, it highlighted the dramatic aspects of the crisis to which commodity society and the suffering it entails have brought us. It is less a question of, quote, defeating, end quote, capitalism than of preventing its collapse, already underway, from ending in barbarism and ruins. Social movements against banks alone are undoubtedly a false response because they take the symptom to be the cause. They revive old stereotypes of, quote, honest, end quote, laborers exploited by, quote, parasites, end quote, and are at risk of degenerating into populism and anti-Semitism. In general, all recourse to, quote, politics, end quote, especially the state, is impossible because the end of accumulation and therefore of, quote, real, end quote, money deprives public authorities of any means of intervention. In order to find an alternative to capitalism, it is first necessary to question the nature of the commodity and money, of labor and value, categories that seem, quote, theoretical, end quote, but whose consequences ultimately determine what we do every day. Thanks for listening.